secret. Accessibility consultants, and I should say that accessibility is not just about the built environment, but accessibility consultants in the built environment have a unique vantage point in the design industry because we get a chance to talk to everybody involved, and we get to also talk to the building owners, the facility managers, the policymakers, and of course, people with disabilities, all while doing building audits, attending design meetings, drawing reviews, writing accessibility standards, and training and research. We have a treasure trove of secrets, in fact, that really aren't secrets at all, especially if you're a person with a disability. But they feel like secrets because almost nobody seems to know about them. So I want to share my top 6 insider secrets with you today so that you can leave feeling confident with the knowledge that you have and so that you can know how you can help make things better. You might think that, in fact, making buildings accessible is really the job of other people, the building owners, the designers, who need to work on this. But if you work or volunteer or live somewhere or go to school, you too can help. In fact, you don't have to play a direct role in the build and design of your building. Your influence as a building user makes you more powerful than you could ever know, and able to influence success in achieving inclusion. Especially because we're on the verge of having the Accessible Canada Act passed into law. It's never been a better time for Canadians to be more aware of what's happening with accessibility. So my question is, are we creating fully accessible buildings and places? We've been working for decades to improve accessibility. Has all the hard work been worth it? Are we there yet? Well, while effort does count, we know it doesn't guarantee results. For example, have you ever worked on a floor really hard only to find you accidentally painted yourself into a corner? So the first secret is a big one. The belief that we're doing a decent job at accessibility has been taking a firm hold. We've seen this belief itself become a key barrier because if you're doing a good job, there's no need to change our codes, our standard practices, or our education or anything else. So don't take my word for it. Let's see what social media is telling us. And there's lots of good news. All kinds of people and organizations working on improving accessibility. In fact, I really hope you'll be checking out the Smart Cities Library, 8 to 80 Cities, Access Chat, which is a worldwide group, and more locally, the Older Women's Network of Ontario and their Living in Place campaign. We also find the AODA Alliance's Picture Our Barriers campaign, where people tweet hashtag AODAFail with pictures showing barriers they find all over Ontario. And there are 3 YouTube videos about brand new colleges and transportation facilities. We also see apps like Access Now, which allow disabled people to report their experiences of buildings and places and how accessible they find them to actually be. But barriers are being called out too as discrimination. Like this tweet from His Honor David Onley, the former Lieutenant Governor of Ontario, here calling out a sign on an exterior path that shows the international symbol of accessibility inside of a red circle with a red line over it. While likely meant to indicate that the path itself is not accessible, it can also be interpreted as no people with disabilities. Yikes. And the term ableism is just everywhere on the internet. Ableism and discrimination is never something anyone wants to associate with their business or brand. So barriers in buildings and spaces are being called out in public. If they are mistakes, they're certainly not benign mistakes. Now, this isn't meant to be discouraging, but we need to be honest. If we've been working for decades to try to make this better and we really are not seeing improvements, we need to come up with better and different solutions. And while we might accept that older buildings would be inaccessible, we're presuming that new buildings are actually far more accessible than they are. People with disabilities are telling us they're not. We get asked a lot, can you name a building that is a good example? People want to go see something, right? I can name some that are better than most, but not one place that's fully accessible. Not one I could award a gold star to for the whole building. Not one that's designed or built without mistakes, or includes everything we already know that needs to be done. Most of our current best are really providing better access for wheelchair users. This is despite the fact that we changed the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms and our Human Rights Code over 30 years ago to say that people with disabilities are equals and built spaces shall not discriminate against them. Despite Canada having signed the UN's Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities back in 2010. Despite the new urban agenda having accessibility as an integral part of the goals. Despite the Sustainable Design Guidelines having accessibility. And despite the visionary and inclusive requirements in municipal standards that have been around since 2001. But we're still surrounded by barriers? Yes. The AODA Alliance videos are sadly not anomalies. They're unfortunately the rule. Barriers are hiding in plain sight. People don't know what they're looking at. Are they in our design magazines? In buildings and places winning design awards? In our latest design trends? Okay, so let's do a quick think about this. What makes a building accessible? Well, I bet like most people, you'd think about 4 separate things. Ramps, power door openers, elevators, and washrooms. So if we've done all 4 of these things, we're done, right? Not even close. Not even close to all that we know that needs to be done. And of course, there are things that we haven't yet thought about that probably need to be done too. Now, assuming even the things that we've mentioned have been done right in the first place, these are really focusing on the needs of wheelchair users, not those with vision loss, hearing loss, who are deaf, autistic, amputees, or have multiple chemical sensitivities, cognitive impairments, guide and service animals, or scooters, or any of the above. I'm sure the list is much longer. In fact, what we're seeing is that when people ask me to report how inclusive a design is, I typically am reporting that 70 to 80% of the design is either wrong for accessibility or still missing accessibility elements. That's how bad it is. So my point is, we can't get better if we don't know that we need improvement. So if you keep believing we're doing a good job, that's still a barrier. So secret 2, we're not providing equality and life safety. Here's an example of how we're missing the mark. Our building code has contradictions. For one, it's supposed to be about protecting life and safety. But during a fire, what does the sign by the elevator say? In case of fire, do not use the elevator. If your average building is sprinklered, which most new buildings are, no area of refuge is required. What's an area of refuge? It's simply an identified safe place to wait for rescue. If you can't use the stairs, that's smoke protected with 2-way communication so you can let people know you're there. When the fire alarm is activated, an able-bodied person gets to go to the nearest stairs and leave the building, even if the building is sprinklered. But if you can't take the stairs, how is leaving people behind equality? So what can you do? Don't wait for the fire code to be fixed. Require additional accessibilities in your building contracts, including extra space for areas of refuge, which is only 1 meter extra in every exit stair that you have, even if the building is sprinklered. Secret 3, the building code and the AODA are not the only laws that must be followed. We don't know the laws. Most people don't know our Human Rights Code actually prevails over the building code and the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act. People often mistakenly only design up to code because they don't know the Human Rights Code requires design not to discriminate, even if it doesn't tell you how to create it. The Human Rights Tribunal has published articles warning that if a complaint comes about your building or space to their court, they do not accept as a defense that the building has followed the code in the AODA. That's pretty shocking for most people. So, we need to significantly improve legislation because currently the design construction process has to guess what more to do above code, and each building can pick a different set of guidelines. This isn't consistent or predictable for people with disabilities, and it's hard to impossible for the design build industry to do in a competitive bid environment. Consistency and predictability is very important for people with disabilities. Secret 4, did you know that the building code exempts housing from accessibility requirements? Unless you're in Ontario, but it's only then for apartments and condos. Anyone who's helped their aging parents with housing knows that we're already in the midst of an accessible housing crisis, or if you have kids with disabilities. But in Ontario, it's only for 15% of apartments. How is this possible, given the Charter of Rights and Freedoms? We likely all want and deserve the right to find a house that meets our budget, has the amenities to suit our lifestyle, and is in the right location. Now imagine not having a choice at all, but being forced to settle for imperfect options from a limited pool, if they can find anything at all. I know many people who've been on waiting lists for decades. This is not equality. In 2018, a new infographic from the Canadian Survey on Disabilities was published, showing lots, but that the number of people with disabilities identifying with a disability in Canada had risen to 22%. That's ahead of schedule from what we thought it would be. So if we apply that to our current numbers, that means we're up at 8 million Canadians reporting having a disability. And I'm emphasizing reporting, you'll see why in a second. These numbers are underreported, and I'll show you. It doesn't capture people who won't check a box on their census form. All kinds of people who don't feel they have a real disability, or any of the temporary disabilities we all experience. But if it's really 1 in 5 people, where are they all? 70% of people with disabilities look just like me. I pass as an able-bodied person because my disabilities don't require me to use an obvious mobility aid like a wheelchair or a white cane. And have you ever considered that we're all only temporarily abled? 100% of us are an illness, accident, or aging away from acquiring a disability. And it's not just about the physical features of our houses. What about the community aspect of housing? This is what we call in the industry visitable design. Current inaccessible design means not everyone can come to visit for coffee, borrow a cup of sugar, babysit, go trick-or-treating, come for a barbecue, or even stay for a few days. This creates isolation, which we know is bad for mental health. And we're spending a lot of time and effort on trying to improve mental health, haven't we? Have we been considering housing? And because design isn't even required to be adaptable, transforming your home as your needs and the needs of your loved ones change so that we can age in place, like 90% of us want to, is prohibitively expensive. Did you know that we have over 1,000 Canadians a day turning 65? What are we gonna do? Are we gonna build long-term care homes for everybody? I'm not sure we can afford that. Requiring accessible design is simply smarter planning. Secret 5, our building legislation and standards don't always use evidence-based dimensions in the requirements. They generally are not based on the research for what people need. What? Most designers are assuming the numbers in the code are correct. So how are our standards and legislation created? Well, they're generally created by committee. Have you ever tried to create anything by committee? Does the word compromise ring a bell? And there's nothing wrong with compromise as long as somebody doesn't end up feeling compromised. And committee decisions that are done behind closed doors, that don't have to report what items were discussed, why any decision was made, and who voted for or against? Or what if the deciders don't represent the people they're deciding the requirements for? Like maybe men deciding on women's health legislation. Nothing about us without us. People with disabilities always need to be included with full decision transparency. That's something you can help make sure happens. Last secret, secret 6, people think accessibility is hard and expensive. And when you're trying to renovate inaccessible places, you're often right. But people apply the lesson too broadly, talking themselves out of accessibility altogether, even in new places. This discouraging belief is pretty ingrained in our design-build culture. But it's only hard and expensive because we're designing by creating for able-bodied people, and then after trying to make it accessible for people with disabilities. As I said, even in new construction. When anyone starts to worry about building accessibility accommodations, ask them about something called life cycle costing. How much would it cost to fix later versus doing it right in the first place? It might also be useful to remind them that these new-to-them accommodations aren't any more expensive than it is to provide chairs for an audience of people who don't bring their own, like most of us today, or all of the lighting that we provide for those of us who aren't blind. Most accommodations help make spaces better for everyone. We also sabotage projects by starting accessibility far too late. We already have the location, we've defined the space, and we've set the budgets. When we start to hire an architect or a build team, we might add additional accessibility standards like the City of Mississauga's Facility Accessibility Design Standards, and that's a great idea. But our educational institutions are not protecting us because they're not training their designers the way we think they are. They're not including inclusive design as a part of their curriculum and outcomes. So when I'm doing my training, it's not uncommon to hear people say, "No one ever taught us this. I never thought of that." So we need to update the fundamental principles design-build professionals are educated with. And while having an accessibility consultant be a part of the team, it increases the chances of access, but of course it doesn't guarantee success. Because, we're consultants, we give advice, we're not dictators. If they choose to ignore us, who's choosing to listen to that advice? But the good news is getting accessibility right is not rocket science. We can do something simple like color contrast. That helps a lot. And here are 4 things you can do to try to ensure that the 20% that is a little harder to do is captured. Functional programming, where we make sure the accessibility space requirements are included. The feasibility study, where we make sure that we have the budget for the assistive equipment, like assistive listening for all service counters. Furniture and fixture and equipment lists, where we're trying to make sure the accessibility features are included in things like the phone. And accessibility commissioning, which is a process that's already well in use in the green design and sustainable design process. It means that anything that they find at the end of construction that's not right, the contractor has to fix at their cost. So, generally, we're approaching accessible design in the wrong way. We have a lot of work to do, but together, I think we can do it. Thank you.